Hey guys, Kelsey here from roughandtumblefarmhouse.com, and I'm going to share with you today a very abridged short version of my son Charlie's birth story because he has finally arrived. So this is going to be a little bit different than previous birth stories I have shared. I shared in pretty great detail the story of my last daughter being born. Both my girls I've had at a hospital with a midwife, which has been really positive so far. And this birth story really wasn't positive. It didn't really go particularly well. No faults of my own. He came out fine and everything, and that all worked out fine in the end, but the whole laboring process looked a lot different than it did with my other two girls, and I'm not really in a space to talk about it at this moment. I'm just a little over a week postpartum, and if any of you are postpartum or have been postpartum, you know that's really a very sensitive time as it is, let alone to talk about something that was a little bit traumatic, to be honest. And then also I'll get into the fact that we had to do a NICU stay. So looked a lot different than my last two births, but he's here and he's healthy, and so let's dive into it. So I went in on the Friday before Christmas just to get checked. I was a week past my due date, which was a little bit different. Again, both my girls, one came 2 days early, one came right on her due date. So that was just already kind of odd that he was taking a little bit longer to cook in there. But the test went fine. They did an ultrasound to make sure he had enough fluid in there still. They did a stress test to make sure that he was just doing okay in there, and he was fine. And actually, when they were checking me, my midwife, and normally I don't do cervical checks because they're really kind of pointless. You can be dilated at whatever for days on end before you actually go into labor. So my midwife, when they had me kind of hooked up to the monitors and stuff, she said, you're actually contracting regularly right now. Do you realize that? I was like, well, it feels a little uncomfortable, but it's nothing I would really consider a contraction, I guess. And then she said I was dilated to about a 2.5, 3. And she said, well, you can stay here at the clinic if you want, or at the hospital, and just kind of walk the halls until things get going. Or, I think you got plenty of time, you can go home. And I said, well, yeah, I'd like to go home. So we live a little over a half hour away from the clinic. Drove home to dinner with my girls, bath time, just kind of enjoyed our last night as a family of 4, knowing that he was going to be coming very soon. And then at about midnight, so my appointment on that Friday had been, I think it was at 3:30. And so at midnight, I had the first bam contraction where I said, okay, this is happening now. And so we went into the clinic when my contractions were lasting a little over a minute, and they were about 3 to 4 minutes apart. So they were coming pretty consistently, and I was kind of took a little bit of focus, but I could still manage through them just fine. So, I'm going to skip over all the rest of the stuff because it's like I said, it's just frustrating, and it just wasn't the same as my previous experiences. It's nothing where it was like this crazy stuff happened, but things just weren't handled very well. And so I don't want to talk about it, and I'm not gonna. So we're going to skip ahead to when he was born. He was born at 8:47 in the morning, and my husband actually got to catch him. And I finally thought of an analogy good for people who've never had, or for husbands more so, trying to explain, because I know a lot of people, they're like, oh, you can do pain-free birth. I don't know how you do that. What sort of body yours is, I don't know. It's amazing. You're a super woman. But I've yet to have a pain-free birth, especially the pushing phase. I've done unmedicated births with all 3 of my kids. And I told my husband, okay, imagine you swing a hammer and when you hit your thumb as hard as you possibly can, how badly that hurts. Okay, now imagine you have to willingly make yourself do it again, and knowing that only repeatedly hitting yourself on the thumb on the same spot over and over as hard as you can is going to let you be done with that. That is the closest I can think of an analogy for that last pushing phase. But so he actually came out when the pushing started. He came out very quickly. He came out, I had to push for an hour and a half with both of my girls. I pushed for maybe 15 minutes with him, and he was out. And again, my husband got to catch him, which was cool. Everything was fine. Looked fine. He was doing great. He was nursed right away. He nursed like a champ. So that was really good. And then my mom came. She brought my daughters to come meet him, and she noticed that he was breathing a little difficult. He was having some difficulty breathing. He was kind of pulling. You could just see under his ribs. He was really having to pull to breathe. And so they did a glucose test, and his glucose levels were super duper low. And so then they did an x-ray, and it showed he had some fluid in his lungs. So by about 2 o'clock in the morning, So he wasn't even 24 hours old. My midwife informed me that we'd be going by ambulance to Fargo, which is the closest NICU unit to us, because he was going to need some additional care. So that was crazy. And so I wasn't allowed to ride in the ambulance with him because I had been admitted into a hospital as a patient within 48 hours. So I thought I was going to have to drive my minivan by like an hour and a half to Fargo behind the ambulance, but thankfully my sister-in-law was able to come, which was very nice, and drive me to the hospital there, to the NICU unit. So what he had is something called transient tachypnea, which is very common in C-section babies and babies that are born very quickly. So when babies are in utero, they are breathing in amniotic fluid. They have fluid in their lungs. It's just part of what they do in there. And then through the birth process, usually through like a vaginal delivery, as they get squished through the birth canal, it squishes all of that fluid out of their lungs. So it's usually not that big of a deal. But in cases where a baby is born fast, like he was, once he was coming, he was just coming out of there. The fluid doesn't always get a chance to get out of their lungs. And then the same with C-section babies, they aren't being squished through anything at all. They're just being pulled out. So that's where it can be a bigger issue. So we got to the NICU and he had to have an oxygen thing. It's basically a CPAP, but it still looked horrible. It was like this hat with this thing and these straps. And then he had to have a feeding tube and an IV, and it was very hard to see your like less than day old baby in that situation. And of course I have just given birth, so any of you have also given birth, you know there's a lot happening with your body. So I was immediately using their pump, so that way when they wanted to start giving him milk, instead of having to use donor milk, I really am not a big formula fan. Nothing against people who use formula, by the way. It's just not, good for you, not for me. And so I wanted to avoid that. So I was able to, thankfully, my supply was enough that I was able to get most of his milk. They just had to top off a little bit with formula. By the time we left, it was just all my own milk, which I was really grateful for. But so he really recovered very quickly. We were very, very lucky. I don't know how those families that are in the NICU for weeks or months, I don't know how they manage. It is so tough. It is so tough. So we went in Christmas Eve. We got there at about 7 a.m. and Christmas Day around 2 p.m. we were able to go home. And so it was just a process of kind of weaning him off of his supports. They took the oxygen off the night before, and then feeding tube came out, and then they reduced his fluids through his IV, and the IV came out, and so all this stuff. And his glucose stabilized really quickly, and he nursed so well. And I think that was one of the big things that helped us to be able to leave sooner than most do. They said this is about as quick a NICU stay as you could possibly hope for. So we got to come home, and then we had his first appointment a day or so later. But we got home, we told our kids it was Christmas Eve, even though it's Christmas Day. They're little, they don't know the difference. We did Christmas Eve, we did Christmas Day the next day, and then he had an appointment. And then we had one day at home, and at the appointment, they were a little worried about his bilirubin, so we had to test that and kind of hang out in that town because we live about a half hour from there. So that was kind of stressful, but his bilirubin was fine. The last of his blood tests all came through clear and fine. No bacteria or anything in there. And then, because that was another additional concern, is that I'm group B positive, and also I'm allergic to a couple of different antibiotics. The antibiotic I went on for group B is normally a penicillin type 1, but there are some contraindications with that in my allergy. So I was on an antibiotic for group B that would help him, but isn't like the best antibiotic against it. So they really wanted to be cautious about that. So they took blood cultures to make sure he didn't have any bacteria growing that would be like the group B situation. So anyway, then we had the public health nurse came out just to check his weight. And I'm very pleased to say that he was 2 full ounces over his birth weight already. And he, I think, had just turned a week old, and she said that they hope to see them at their birth weight at the 2-week appointment. And so we were at 1 week and we were already past the birth weight. So he's nursing like a champ. He's doing really well. He's just lovely. His older sisters are both fascinated by him and also kind of tired of him, I think, at the same time, which is to be expected a little bit. But so that is Charlie's birth story. He is here. We named him Charlie James after Charlie comes from, I have my grandma Bonnie, so my dad's mom's dad was Charlie Cuthbert, actually, of all things. But we weren't going to name him baby Cuthbert. We couldn't do that to him. He went by Charlie. And then it turns out, actually, too, on my mom's side, her dad's grandpa he was a Charles, but also went by Charlie. He was a barber in North Dakota. Not that you need to know any of this stuff, but now you do. So that's the name. And then James is for my dad, who goes by Jim, but Charlie Jim just doesn't have the same flow as Charlie James. So that's our sweet boy. That's his sort of abridged birth story. We're home. We're trying to get a hang of being, a family of 5 now, and with the farm and everything, but we're getting through, slow but sure, and hopefully more sleep comes. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you everybody for the kind words over on Instagram and Facebook, offering just your support and prayers for our little guy and for our family. They're very much appreciated. So we will see you next week. That is, if I have myself together enough and I'm getting more sleep. I'll see you next week for more farming, family, food, and fortitude here at our Rough and Tumble farmhouse.